All right, we're recording, so we are recording. Okay. So today's going to be a bit different from yesterday. We're going to go through a few other parts of the exam. Today's covering 3 and 4. 1740, 1800. Bring your orange juice. Bring your orange juice. Okay. Unit 3 starts DB2 territory, or 3 through 8. Your DB2 questions with something from units 3 to 8. So like say again, like the bulk of your review should be for that chunk of the course, right? Just me personally. You can choice question groups, you short answer questions, you might see a long essay. This is like where the meat of the course starts. And look, Ben Franklin, Albany. Okay. So what kind of conflict is taking place in Frenchman v. Moore? 1763 is a very important year for kind of a lot of things that happen that are on the board happen around 1763. The French and Indian War ends. The colonists, the American colonists, help Britain fight the war and win the war, and they, feel very good about themselves. Like, oh, yes, I helped mommy and daddy. They're going to be so proud of me. And the British rationale is the complete opposite, and say we spent all of this money fighting this war overseas for our dinky little colonies, and now they're going to have to pay for it. They should be the ones to pay for it, not Great Britain. So that's going to end the policy of salutary neglect, and Britain's going to tighten its control on the American colonies, which again leads to conflict. The Native Americans will lose their French allies in North America, and then as a result of that, the natives will be pushed further west. They're going to lose a lot of their power and influence after 1763. There's going to be more arguments for independence as the British step up their domination of the colonies. So you're going to see like Paul Revere, give me liberty or give me death. And he was one of the guys that was instrumental in getting the word out about the Boston Massacre. He's the one that made the engraving that we looked at early in the beginning of the year. Mercy Otis Warren is going to write a lot and form a lot of like grassroots support to support independence. And again, like she was also like a woman, but also an elite. So yay, women having influence, but also she's like, part of that 1% of, women like Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, that, had the ear of the powerful men in society. And again, I covered it yesterday, but think about too, the Enlightenment ideas are gaining more steam. And if you remember one, remember Locke and natural rights. But if you want to remember more, I'd recommend Rousseau and his idea of a social contract, okay? And also like Thomas Paine's common sense that just questions Britain's domination of the colonies and makes arguments like the American colonies don't need a mother country. The American colonies don't benefit from British colonization. Their size, they're bigger than Britain, so they should be independent. And like all of this helps all that really helps more and more support the ideas of independence. So they have a revolution and the American colonists win and become the United States of America. And what does the country look like after the American Revolution? Again, like you've kind of done foreign policy recently, so we could call it isolationism. We could also call it realism. Because in that, again, George Washington's farewell address that he gave at the end of his term, and he said, no entangling alliances with Europe, so like no military alliances. differences. Don't get caught up in the wars between Britain and France, because at the end of the 1700s, Britain and France just loved to go to war with each other. But he said trade was okay, which is why I put realism there, right? U.S. foreign policy, or direction of U.S. foreign policy, is done to benefit the United States, you know, not other countries that aren't the United States. So, you know, I like to put realism with that. The first government, or at least the first framework of government, was the Articles of Confederation, and that was a big old fail for reasons that we covered in class previously, but it made the national government way too weak, right? And that kind of makes sense because the United States was coming out of a monarchy, right? So they're going to intentionally make the central government weak and the state governments way too strong, and that was, again, a big old fail. There was no real central government, there was no army, there was no way to tax, there was no uniform currency, and kind of all these problems that resulted out of that shock of being under a monarchy of many years. And then if you need an event to show like this is the thing that made most of the leadership in the country realize that a change needs to be made, big states rebellion, right? Like the farmer rebellion in Massachusetts that just shut down the courts for, you know, months and months and months in the state. Nobody could do anything because, you know, there was no army, there were no taxes, the government couldn't do anything. So they make up the U.S. Constitution, which is basically a bunch of compromises between the 13 colonies. You've got things like the Great Compromise, which is just representation, made the small states happy with the House of the Senate, equal representation. And then the large states were happy with the House of Representatives, which was based on state population. The 3/5 compromise counted some of the slave population towards the state's representation in Congress, and that made the southern states happy. But it also, think about for future units, that gave the South kind of a increased power and influence in the federal government, because they're going to have more Congress people than they probably should by the end of the 1800s, because the enslaved population will balloon. People, they didn't have suffrage rights, they didn't have any rights at all, but the South is benefiting from them living and working and, you know, basically being kept prisoner in that state. And also the Commerce Compromise, which basically gave states control out of commerce and trade within their state, but it gave the federal government control over commerce between the states. It set up a two-house legislature. It set up a system of federalism, which limited federal power. So if you're looking at like your pocket constitution, for example, the rights for the federal government are delegated, right? So that those rights are given. The power to have an army, the power to coin money, for example, is delegated to the federal government, but the state's powers are reserved. They're kept safe, right? So power over their own commerce, power over the ability to borrow money, and, you know, all that other good stuff. And then in order to appease the anti-federalists who felt that the Constitution didn't go far enough to protect civil rights, a Bill of Rights was written up, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. That's where you get your freedom of speech, press, right to a fair trial, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, and like all of that as well. So, what do we have to do now? Okay. So this is yesterday we did short answer and multiple choice. Today we're going to very briefly look at the long essay question. Is that 1 minute 3? Yes, it is. Okay. So the long essay question is part 2, section B of the APUSH exam. And that's administered after your break. So after you complete the short answer questions in part 1, you get like a little 10-minute break and have a snack and, you know, just chill out for a couple of minutes. And then you go into the FRQs, the DDQ, and the long essay. And again, like the suggested writing time is 40 minutes, but you have an hour 40 for the DBQ and the long essay, so you can manage this however much you want, but the College Board says you should probably take about 40 minutes to write this thing. There's a rubric posted on your Blackboard bulletin board. Okay, it's been up there since the beginning of the year. It's out of 6 points. It's the College Board rubric. I think also if they gave you back your last test, that's a copy of the long essay rubric as well. So I have a sample essay, and this is one that's made by the College Board to evaluate the extent to which United States independence fostered change in the relationship between American Indians and American settlers from 1760 through the 1800s. I've given you a sample thesis to work with because looking at your writing, I feel pretty good about our thesis statements. You need to hit where you need to hit. Remember, with thesis statements, it's got to be a historically defensible statement. It's got to address the prompt. So this is the one that I gave you to kind of play around with here. So the United States independence changed the relationship between American Indians and settlers a great deal because it removed the British government's check on settlers' westward movement and led to new efforts by settlers to take Indian land. So at the end of the American Revolution, the United States wins, and all of those things, like all of those little restrictions that I don't want to like give up because that's going to be your assignment for right now. All those restrictions that the British were placing on the colonists went away in 1783 and after the war. So that's our argument. My recommendation, I've got because in a different color and underlined. My recommendation for you is when you write a thesis statement, try to put because in there, okay? Because if you do that, you're going to have to give some kind of reason for your argument, okay? So you start off with, okay, it changed. Things between settlers and Native Americans changed because, and then this is your historically defensible statement. Well, because the British were gone, so the settlers, had more freedom, and this is going to lead to like differences in how natives and Americans interact with each other. So playing around with this thesis statement, I want you to take right now about 5 to 6 minutes. Think of 2 pieces of evidence you can use to support this thesis. Like if this was your essay and this was your thesis statement, what might you write about in your body paragraphs? Just 2 pieces of outside info. And we will check back in at 2:51. Okay. Is this recording? Yes, it is. Okay, great. There's some stuff in the Quizlet too if you're stumped. Leave game. 3, 4. 2 minutes remaining. We in unit 4 yet? We are in unit 4. Okay. Oh, we'll be in unit 4 next. Okay. Okay, who's got some lovely evidence that could support this thesis? Haley?
I said manifest destiny.
Okay, so you could talk about manifest destiny, right? Because the frontier by 1800 has really opened up. What else could you talk about, Jerry? Exactly. So you could talk about the proclamation line, and then after the war, that was gone. Alexa, the Louisiana Purchase, right? Double the size of the country, and then you could pair that. You could chunk that with manifest destiny. Nancy. Pontiac's Rebellion, okay, that's like the reason for the proclamation line as well. Any other takers before we move on? Yeah. You could talk about Lewis and Clark expedition, right? That again encourages more manifest destiny because people are going to learn about what's out west. Any other takers before? Okay, good. So you mostly you got my kind of. I didn't put Louisiana Purchase up there because I thought that would be the first one, but Proclamation 1763. Good. You could bring up, and again, someone had this question yesterday, and I can't remember. Could you use Native American treaties and whatnot? Do you have to list specific names of Native American treaties? Not exactly. There were too many to count, but if you bring up land treaties between the U.S. federal government and Native Americans, that would be a good thing. However, once again, I say the U.S. has broken every single treaty with the Native Americans. That could also be a good little bit of information you could put there if this was your essay question. Say, well, they made treaties with the natives, but they also broke single ones. Conflict / disrespect really to those Native American tribes. Who were the real Americans? Think of that for your social history assignment as well. If you want to think of a tribe I always liked the Iroquois Confederacy because they were the largest in the Northeast, and just I think being from New York, you've probably heard of them at some point. Battle of Fallen Timbers was 1794. That was U.S. federal government versus Native battle. I think in the Ohio River Valley that you could think about. And one of you gave us Pontiac's rebellions. That's all good information you could use up there. So conflicts, okay, and if you get asked about Native U.S. relations, you're going to be writing about some kind of conflict, right? Especially in the early period with like 1800s. They just want each other. As opposed to units 1 and 2, where there was some kind of collaboration, cooperation, because especially the American colonists, they needed the Native Americans to survive. They needed to trade with them. By the late 1700s, early 1800s, that becomes, making nice with the Native Americans becomes less of a need. So this is period 4, 1800 to 1848. So our revolution of 1800, so our first, peaceful transfer of power from the Federalist Party, John Adams, to the Democratic Republic, Thomas Jefferson. This includes westward expansion and manifest destiny, which is why I gave you that sample essay question. And again, we're in DDQ territory, so basically you could see any question on the APUSH exam covering this material, but you're kind of lucky in that it's a short unit, at least 48 years. So this portion of the review is a bit more audience participation. We've seen this before. Think about. Before thinking about point of view, who is that? Alexia? It is Andrew Jackson, yes. And who was Andrew Jackson? U.S. president. Anything else about Andrew Jackson that we should probably know? Yeah. Right. He's dressed up. They've got him dressed up as a European monarch, right? Tyrant. Yeah. He was a war hero before becoming president, right? The Battle of New Orleans, War of 1812, right? So if you see, or even if you see documents written by Andrew Jackson, think about like hero, first of the big Democrats. What else?
He was also like around this time we announced universal male suffrage.
Yes,
Universal white male suffrage.
exactly.
And on top of that, he wasn't one of the elite. He was one of the elite. And as well as being a worker, he was very attractive, for lack of a better word, to a good majority of the population.
Yeah, because again, it seemed like he more so than previous presidents, he seemed like more of a regular guy rather than like the Virginia crew, like the Washington and Madison and Jefferson and these guys that were seen as like the top 1% of society. Jackson would marketed himself as a country boy, and since they opened up suffrage, universal white male suffrage before Jackson, it was basically landowning males could vote. During and after Jackson, it was open to, again, male citizens, which again, like white males. But Jackson was seen as like this, kind of a common guy's president, and it's going to change, at least it's going to change the way that people run for president too. There's going to be like nominating campaigns. Candidates need to travel to different states and give speeches and campaign in order to be considered, in order to legit run for president. But yeah, the point of view of this cartoon, like what Sophie said before, is that, Jackson is abusing his presidential power, and who can remember some ways that he abused that, or some ways that historians and others, the Federalists argued that he abused his power. Ashley? Yes, so he vetoed the charter of the Second National Bank, so he's going to kill the bus, right? What else did he do, Nancy? The Indian Removal Act, he's going to get that pushed through in Congress, and what else? If Indian removal's on here, because most of Congress supported Indian removal. Those jerks. He supported Indian removal. He also, there was a Supreme Court case that he said, hey, I'm not gonna, Alexa. Yes.
Yeah, it was a court case with the Cherokee, and Cherokee won, but it was just like, nah, I think it's different. We want that.
All right, like Worcester v. Georgia, and the court sided with the Cherokee and said that the Removal Act was unconstitutional, and Jackson said, well, they're still getting removed, I don't care, which again is abuse of power. So you could say, did he abuse his power as president if you're using Worcester v. Georgia as an example? Yeah. If you're using the veto of the bus, he used the veto as a weapon against Congress, and that was kind of the first time that you see that. But other examples of using the Johnson used the veto a lot. FDR, but FDR was in office for so dang long that I think like just almost 12 years. That's a lot of vetoes. Okay, next, audience participation. What's the historical context? For historical context must be detailed what's going on in the country at the time that this was created. And I was a jerk for not giving you the caption, but there's a reason for that. Yes, Jeremy.
I forgot what terms of honor the women were starting to push for temperance and the ban of alcohol.
Yes. So women are going to be being active in the temperance movement, moderation, particularly in alcohol.
Wasn't it called the Republican mother?
Republican motherhood came a little bit before that, but it's on the same motif that, you know, women were more like moral, right? And then it was seen as, you know, women should not be drinking and smoking. So it kind of made sense that women would support a temperance movement. Yes. Yes. Okay, especially like the lower to middle class families, the husbands that were engaged in like factory labor and everything. There was an uptick in abuse of alcohol and drinking, especially drinking alone. It was no longer like a social thing, you know, by the 1800s, and they would again get so drunk that they would, you know, abuse their families upon coming home. So that was another big reason why women supported temperance so much. Dates, anything, historical context, if you had to like set this up in a short answer question or something. Yeah. 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 So think like that Second Great Awakening time period where all of those reform movements are going on. And again, like not just temperance too, but women participated and continued to participate even after the 1800s in reform movements. Again, do they have much political power? Not really. But they can support these reform movements, right? Like temperance and abolitionism and women's suffrage and education reform, and they can have their voice that way. But even after they get the right to vote, they still, you know, engage in reform movements too. Okay, last thing we have, is that settled? No, it's not. We have a sample multiple choice question. So remember what I said about multiple choice questions. Take a look at the author first. Do we know anything about Mr. Calhoun? Alexia? He was a supporter of slavery. Good. Anything else about Mr. Calhoun favorite?
I don't remember exactly. Wasn't he a supporter of extinctions?
Yes, he was an expansionist supporter. Yes.
I was gonna say that.
Okay.
Wanted to repeat what you.
Yes, he was against the tariffs that I think Jackson had pushed through or tried to push through. What else, Abby? So he's one of the ones, like, he's not like a Jefferson. We know this is bad, but we know how to stop it. He was a, you know, slavery is good. It should continue because it's good for the South and it's good for the white Southerners. It's good for the slaves. Anything else about John C. Calhoun? So if you, again, my recommendation is if you know a ton about the author, take a look at the question and see if you can answer this question without really reading the document in super duper details. Try and see if you can get the correct answer. I mean, if you know a lot about the author, sometimes it's always good to go back and scan the document and just see if, make sure they're not trying to do you dirty on the column of the English exam, but you've got 55 minutes to answer 55 of these questions. Think about which answer choices are obviously incorrect too. Jerry, think about it.
I said, one said, my system that we think space system is subject to protect happens by the
Yes, good. So, right, Calhoun's saying here, I hold it to be a good. So, like what Ani mentioned before, absolutely right. Like he was one of the ones. Good flushing, right? And this shows that, and again, if you're looking at the answer choices, many in the South who depended became more, no, as you get to 1830s, there's less and less in the South that are willing to admit that slavery is a sin. More and more are going to be on the same side of Calhoun saying it's good. Abolitionists scheduled numerous, but they would have been shot abolitionists if they went to the South and spoke against slavery. Those people would have been killed. 4, Congress passed legislation guaranteeing slavery in the South. That never happened, but the South wanted it, right? That was one of the that was one of the reasons why they seceded eventually, because they wanted federal legislation protecting slavery, and the Republicans in the North were not doing that. So yeah, this is that increase doubling down on the side of these Southerners to keep holding on to their ideology and their institution. That's one of the big reasons why the war happened. They could not let go of slavery, even though we did that case study and economically it was starting to hurt the South. They did not care. It was too ingrained in their society. Okay, it's about 3:05 right now. Do we have questions? Because this is the last thing that I have for you. Okay. If you do have questions, I'm here. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording. I can figure out how to stop the recording. And hopefully